Hi and welcome to History Respond. I'm John Harney, and this week we're going to talk about Command & Conquer Red Alert 3. Command & Conquer Red Alert 3 came out in 2008 and is a real-time strategy game, or RTS. And 2008 was kind of a weird time for RTSs, I would argue. For people my age in particular, the heyday had kind of been the 1990s / early 2000s. You think of Dune 2000, which kind of kicked it all off, and then of course the Command & Conquer series out of EA Westwood. The Red Alert series had been a spin-off of that, which had begun with this idea of an alt history where basically World War III is kind of happening, or a version of that is happening, and the Allies, the Soviet Union, are fighting each other, and Albert Einstein travels back in time to kill Hitler, then kind of changing history. It goes on. In the second Red Alert game, the tone got much sillier, and in this game, it's pretty silly.
Mr. President, I'd like you to meet our new commander on the ground.
Greetings, Commander. You ready to send those commies running back to their mommies?
So, Command & Conquer Red Alert 3. It's an RTS with attack move in mouse controls, where you can control any one of three factions: the USSR, the Allies, or the Empire of the Rising Sun, a kind of a hyper-stylized version of what is basically fascist Japan. Other elements, or I guess one big element of its 2008-ness, is the way that it presents women. It's not great. It's not ideal. The women in the game are almost exclusively dressed much more salaciously than the men. Their roles are kind of very subservient. It's not great. It's not great for a host of reasons. One of the main creatives in the game talks about, I don't think we could do that now. And they kind of say, at the time, some of the actors weren't like super thrilled about certain aspects of it, whereas other actors kind of saw it for what it was and like, this is what you want me to do. So apparently Ivana Milicevic was just gung-ho for whatever and had to be allegedly asked to tone down some of the double entendres and things like that. But as she says in the oral history, I mean, look at the way they dressed me. What exactly was it they were looking for us to do?
You see, Commander, while you were hiding behind the barricades in Leningrad, our enemy was thrusting deeply into the motherland's tender nether regions.
It is, on the one hand, listen, the game is trying very hard to be camp and to be ridiculous and to be fun, and it does a lot of that. The game is definitely a very camp experience, and it's helped enormously by its performances, by people like J.K. Simmons, by people like Tim Curry, and by people like Ivana Milicevic and Kelly Hu. The game is very kind of, FMV heavy for a game of its time, or of any time, really. And the actual process of making the game was having these actors come in and just do all their stuff in like a day, basically. So even I think Tim Curry, who's in the game quite a lot, basically does like a day of kind of shooting, and he's done. So there's a lot of challenges there for the actors, where this is a time, I think it's quite different now, but still it would vary very much studio to studio, the kind of direction you're getting, or how the whole process kind of works. In this particular game, it looks like they kind of asked the actors to just kind of have fun with it, which I think the vast majority of them seem to have done, and so when it works, it really, really works.
Prepare these coordinates.
No. Please. Please.
Now!
Sir. No. No.
The reality is that in 2008, we're still looking at a world, or we're not that far away from a world, where IGN.com had a babes tab at the top of the website, and multiple websites would do roundups of the booth babes. And so, these video game writers would go to various conferences, and there'd be booth babes there. So like scantily clad women, or just women dressed in some kind of silly way, kind of ushering them towards games and things like that. And so websites would say, here's our top 10 and stuff like that. So it wasn't great. And it's not great kind of in this general sense of, it's not ideal for women to be in a game like that. I don't like playing games where if my wife or daughter walks in, or my son for that matter, I feel really self-conscious and weird. I don't like that. But also it just kind of ties games in, not just to like a male view, but like a really juvenile kind of a male view, and kind of reinforces this idea that games are for like 13 to 15-year-old boys, when they're obviously not. And Command & Conquer Red Alert 3 was not. Like, very much clearly was not made for just, you know, younger players, but was definitely made for a wider audience. So that's kind of a bummer, and how much it kind of turns you off is gonna, you know, your mileage will vary. In terms of what the game does well on that kind of camp over the top thing, so many of the performances are fantastic. You literally have Kodiak bears who've been recruited into the Soviet army and had missiles put on their back. It is hyper ridiculous and fantastic. It is the alt history of an alt history, which is to say that it is the alternate history of an existing Command and Conquer in-game lore slash history. It takes all these ideas from the original kind of game line and deliberately kind of makes them completely over the top. And so you have these really hyper kind of stylized kind of versions of these different factions. And that's really kind of, I think, from my point of view as an historian, the big interest lies with these three factions. You've got the USSR, the Allies, and the Empire of the Rising Sun. And so I'm going to go through them one by one. The USSR I found to be the most fun and kind of the most ridiculous. And I think one of the reasons for that is they lean very heavily into a kind of a popular understanding of what the USSR was. So this is 2008. This is 17 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And even though in the lore of the game, you know, they've lost World War III and they have no choice but to jump into a time machine and go back and kill Einstein, or they decided they don't have any other choice. Funnily enough, I think it really echoes for people, especially people who were old enough to remember or remember the immediate outcome of the fall of the Iron Curtain, the kind of hopelessness of all that, the kind of what at the time seemed so obvious and inevitable. Of course this was going to happen because the fall was so sudden and so decrepit and everything else. There's nary mention of Stalin or anything like that in the Soviet faction, really. Tim Curry, who plays the leader of that faction, is really playing an apparatchik who is at first inferior to the general, the other kind of main Soviet character, but after Einstein is killed, he has become the premier. And except for the famous moment...
But I won't let you have the satisfaction of catching me. I'm escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism. Space!
Of his escape, you know, he doesn't talk about ideology very much at all. He doesn't care that much, or like capitalism is a stand-in for the enemy. And of course we could talk a lot about to what extent that was true. That was certainly the perception among a lot of kind of foreign policy people in the United States at the end of the 20th century. We now know that's not necessarily true, and it's kind of a mixture of different kinds of things. But the Soviet Union, funnily enough, fits with this kind of idea, at least people in the West would have had, even as late as '08 and arguably today, of, well, that's basically what the Soviet Union was like, right? Whereas the Allies then feel completely separated. You know, the Allies, you've got J.K. Simmons doing a kind of a gruff, weird version of kind of an Eisenhower type or a Patton type or something like that. Jonathan Pryce is this very kind of polite, well put together kind of English guy. And then, you know, we get our, you know, you have characters, some of these characters kind of show up in a way, and like, you know, the Captain America, the First Avenger, years later, these kind of stylized romantic ideas of what the British and the Americans were like during World War II. And, you know, a lot's happened in the West since World War II. I mean, in America you have Vietnam, which has this enormous impact on how Americans view the military. Not on every single American, of course, but it changes the discourse around it and how people think about it. And then you also have everything from, you know, disco music and Sony Walkmans to eventually the iPad. And there's this kind of sense that the West, the post-war West, and certainly the wartime West, really is this distant past. Whereas when Westerners look at the Soviet Union, they're not seeing the break as much. And I think part of the reason for that is that in Russia, and in the Soviet Union before it, the break isn't always as clear. For one thing, it's in the state's benefit to regularly remind its people of the role it played in World War II. And World War II, the role the Soviets played in World War II was pivotal. It was really important. It was also horrendously bloody. They suffered absolutely horrendous casualties. Something like 20 million people, Russians, or Soviets I should say, died in World War II. And so there's a lot going on there where politically, even after the death of the Soviet Union, maybe that part of the world, through their own choice, they've not moved on in that same kind of a way. Whereas I think in the West, there's this kind of decisive break. And I don't know that one is better than the other. I think that when, you know, Vladimir Putin's interpretation of World War II justify an invasion of Ukraine, That's obviously bad. But in the West, I think there are people who would not mind a clearer kind of interaction with kind of this post-war idea and the greatest generation and all those kinds of ideas. Finally, The Empire of the Rising Sun. I think that is arguably the part of the game that has aged the most, in the sense that things have changed in the way that Western historians talk about Japan even since 2008. 2008, there was still kind of a debate or discussion about whether to use the F word, fascist, to talk about Japan in the 1930s. Some scholars had been doing it already, some scholars weren't so sure. But by today, in 2026, it's basically kind of accepted that the government in Japan should be seen as a fascist-type government. It was also a government in the 1930s and 1940s that was guilty of just horrendous war crimes. So as much as the West has had this evolving view of Japan, Chinese historians, for example, haven't evolved much. They have a very kind of a clear picture of their view of Japan, not least of which because of the war crimes committed on Chinese soil and against Chinese people. Same for South Koreans, for Filipinos, all these different kind of people in that area that were directly affected by the Empire of Japan. So that's a weird kind of an odd fit, because I think in '08, having Ken Takei, who famously, of course, had played Sulu, be kind of the main leader of that faction, with all these different kind of people around him, not all of whom, by the way, are ethnically Japanese or Japanese American, to represent the Empire of the Rising Sun, is, again, it's kitsch, it's over the top, it's kind of a bit crazy.
Today is the day that destiny has promised us. No longer will we suffer the abasement and the corruption of the foreign barbarians, for as they battled among themselves, we have resurrected our realm, creating a new Empire of the Rising Sun.
Part of the reason that I would argue it kind of maybe works better in '08, or worked, or maybe still works to a certain extent, it doesn't have that same cachet, at least in the West, that, for example, the Nazis have. And then you see it with the Empire of the Rising Sun faction. They have giant mechs, they're very technologically advanced. And so what you have in practice is a Soviet Union faction that is largely informed by a kind of a popular Western memory of the end of the Soviet Union, and perhaps kind of the decay of the Soviet Union, particularly under Brezhnev and under the gerontocracy of the early 80s. You have an Allies faction that is really a snapshot in time of what we think it was in 1945, or a completely over-the-top bonkers version of what we think was like in 1945. And then the Japanese faction is clearly interpreted by, through the lens of 1990s and 2000s Japan, especially in video game circles, where people think of Japan's wealth and think of Japan's technological ability, and also its cultural output. For example, giant mechs, right? And anime, and things like that. So I think that's really interesting that the three factions are interpreted in these three very different ways. And I do think the Japan one struggles a bit, in large part, honestly, because the historical conversations around that have changed so much since 2008. So, and not least of which because of Japanese political movements within Japan today, where there have always been people seeking to reclaim that kind of imperial phase as like something to not be ashamed of. But those numbers, I think, have grown, and their impact on some policy in Japan has grown, relatively modestly, thankfully, but it has grown. And so it's very different. So in '08, it was much easier for people in the West to go, oh, that's a terrible phase in Japanese history that just isn't relevant anymore. We can make fun of it. And I don't know that that's true anymore. So what we're left with, I think, is a really interesting historical outcome of the three factions. And I think it's really, really fascinating, and kind of worth your time to check out, even if it's in FMVs and things like that. Returning to play the game is a bit of a mixed experience, at least it certainly was for me, but the Soviets are still fun, and Tim Curry is a treasure, and you have to respect a man who was invited in to do filming for a day on this video game, something he didn't know a lot about, and they just gave him the script and he gave them gold. So well done, Tim Curry. He really makes the game, and makes it worth people's time. So yeah, I hope you found that interesting. I'm going to try and do some more videos on kind of one game at a time, a different version of the old History Respawn formula. Really appreciate you watching this. I hope you find it interesting. Share with friends and all the like. As you've noticed, the videos are coming every couple of weeks because, you know, life is busy. We're coming to the end of the semester. I have writing deadlines and children and other things, but I'm hoping to see you every couple of weeks over the course of the summer. And again, if you have come here and don't know who we are, please feel free to subscribe. Definitely like the video, and you can find historyrespawn.com for some of our kind of classic content, including some great videos interviewing historians, and some fun podcast episodes between myself and Bob, and between Bob and some other like really, really awesome guests. Thanks for watching.